Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be joining everyone and to be introducing Vincent's fantastic book, Deep Time Reckoning, which I feel honoured to have read already, and even more honoured to be here talking about it and talking to him about it and hearing from all of you and your thoughts about the fascinating issues that he raises about our complex relationship with deep time and how perhaps it might be changing. Any luck with the slide, or shall I just launch straight into it?
Oh, I think let's begin first.
Okay. Well, if the slide makes an appearance at any point, what you'll see is a photograph showing the Korean novelist Han Kang dragging a white cloth through a Norwegian forest. Kang is on her way to deliver her contribution to artist Katie Patterson's Future Library project, for which 100 writers will deposit an unpublished piece of writing over the next 100 years. Each work will be unread until 2114, when the forest will be cut down to provide the paper on which the work will be printed. The first writer to contribute in 2014 was Margaret Atwood. Since then, David Mitchell, Stjan, Elif Shafak, and Karl Ove Knausgaard, as well as Kang herself, have added unread works to the library. The entry for 2020 to be delivered in the summer of 2021 will be by Ocean Vuong. The invitation to each writer is simply to produce a work in the hopes of finding a receptive reader in an unknown future. When describing their involvement in the project, the writers talk of how hopeful Future Library is. Atwood calls it a hopeful answer to the anxious questions confronting us. For Mitchell, it is a vote of confidence in the future. 1 year after their commission, each writer travels to Norway to present their entry in the forest that will become their published work. The image of Kang was taken in May 2019 in what now looks to us like a very different world. In Korean tradition, she says white cloth is used to make both gowns for newborn children and mourning robes. It was, she said, like a wedding of my manuscript with this forest, or a small funeral waiting to be reborn, hopefully. I found myself thinking a lot about this picture of Kang pulling her white cloth through the dark green forest as forests in Australia, California, and Siberia have burned. We've been warned that this is not, in fact, the warmest year, or not only the warmest year in the past 100 years, but also the coolest year of the coming 100. In fact, there's nothing that resembles the coming climate in all of human history. The nearest analogue would be the mid-Pliocene 3 million years ago, when atmospheric carbon last exceeded 400 parts per million. Our relationship with deep time and with the deep future is changing. Future generations will have to live with the world we leave to them, facing the legacies of climate change, ecosystem collapse, sea level rise, and indeed the residues of nuclear waste that will play out for generation after generation. Yet, as Kang pointed out, the white of morning also presages the new. Future Library is a work of promise and trust. It's also a work of deep time literacy. The past 12 months or so has seen a cluster of books published that invite us to develop our ability to read the presence of deep time in our daily lives. Robert Macfarlane's Underland descends into the subterranean world to show how the deep places of myth and imagination have shaped us. Gaia Vince's Transcendence explores the deep time roots of what it means to be human, from our evolution as a storytelling species to our concept of beauty. While in Origins, Lewis Dartnell surveys 1 billion years of Earth history to tell how the modern world is a project of geologic processes. Other works approach deep time in order to address grief. Hugh Raffles' The Book of Unconformities draw on stories of stones, from Neolithic stone circles to a Greenlandic meteorite, to make sense of the sudden loss of his two sisters. And Andrew Snare Magnuson's On Time and Water responds to the loss of Öxarjökull, the first Icelandic glacier to be declared extinct, in order to reflect on our impact on future generations. Many of these works explicitly address the deep future. My own book, Footprints in Search of Future Fossils, asks what material traces and stories we will leave behind. Roman Krasnarik's The Good Ancestor invites us to reflect on the most vital question facing us: how do we become better ancestors? And Robin Wall-Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, published in the UK this year, reminds us that many Indigenous societies around the world have carried this question at their heart for millennia. Vincent Ialenti's Deep Time Reckoning is an important, indeed vital addition to this emerging constellation of work. Onkalo, Finland's deep earth repository for high-level nuclear waste, is one of the most extraordinarily future-minded projects ever undertaken. And now it has an extraordinarily future-minded book to give us an account of what Onkalo is setting out to achieve. The designers and engineers who have made it a reality set a reference period of 250,000 years for keeping future generations safe from this lethal material. And in his account of their endeavours, Vincent shows us how to truly reckon with the tremendous scale and the intimacy of deep time in a project that spans generations. Reading it brings the uncanny sensation of the deep future converging on the present moment and all the difficult, complex ethical questions, as well as practical questions that this brings with it. It recalls, in fact, an experience I had of visiting Onkalo itself and standing in one of the deposition tunnels, 500 meters beneath the surface. In the subterranean hush, it was as if the future visitor from perhaps 10,000 years distant stood at my side. Deep time reckoning is likewise an exercise in learning to see and hear how close we are to the seemingly distant future. Kanga's called the white cloth which she drew through the forest, and in which she bound her future library work, a lullaby for a century-long sleep. Onkalo's deposits will, we hope, sleep safely for a great deal longer. Both projects remind us that if we are to have trust in the future, we require a deep time literacy. As Vincent's work makes clear, we must first learn to reckon with deep time. So Vincent Ialenti is an assistant research professor at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. His research has been supported by the US National Science Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation, and he has published in Social Studies of Science, the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, Physics Today, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, as well as writing for NPR, Forbes, Atlas Obscura, and other public outlets. And we wait with bated breath to hear what he has to tell us about deep time reckoning. So over to you, Vincent.
Right. Well, thank you, David, for the wonderful introduction. Thanks for joining us for this book launch. It's really great to have you here. Your poetic and thoughtful book, Footprints, which I actually have right next to me, has really been an inspiration lately. I'd like to quickly thank Simon Nicholson, Sakina Jinnah, Beth Clevenger, Judy Feldman, at MIT Press for their wonderful work, sort of helping make this book a reality. And thanks to Daiwei Sang, who we met in the beginning of this, and Christine Gilbert at George Washington University for setting up this event. And of course, thanks to everyone who's here, wherever here may be for you, for joining. I was thrilled to see over 200 people sign up for this event, so it's generating some interest, and that's very exciting for me. Writing a book takes a long time. So from 2012 to 2014, I spent 32 months conducting anthropological fieldwork among Finland's nuclear energy and waste experts. I recorded 120 interviews with geologists, managers, chemists, physicists, lawyers, engineers, politicians, regulators, activists, banking professionals, and members of the public. My interest was in the everyday working lives of Finland's uniquely long-sighted nuclear waste repository safety case experts. These experts developed models of geological, hydrological, and ecological events that could potentially occur in Western Finland over the coming tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. The safety case experts routinely reckoned with distant future glaciations, climate changes, earthquakes, human and animal population changes, and more. Their goal was to develop a portfolio of technical evidence supporting Finland's nuclear industry's license application for a government permit to begin building this repository, for formal construction of the repository. They already started digging some for the Onkalo Exploratory Studies Facility. The repository will be located 400 or 450 meters underground on an island called Olkiluoto in the Gulf of Bothnia in the Baltic Sea. Finland's Nuclear Regulatory Authority, which is called STUK, approved the safety case in 2015. And soon after, Finland's Ministry of Employment and the Economy issued the Finnish nuclear waste management company, Posiva, a construction license. So this made Finland the first country in the world to get to this stage of licensing a spent nuclear fuel repository. Now, critical social scientists like me have usually been pretty quick to brush off these long-term repository safety assessment models as reductive constructions or epistemic simplifications of reality. And they have a point. Predicting distant futures is an impossible task. However, as an anthropologist, I see my job as trying to peek inside my informant's worldviews, trying to critically apprehend their thinking's internal logics, no matter how irrational they may initially or originally seem when I show up at fieldwork. So early on in this anthropological thought experiment, something became pretty clear to me. And that's that most of my field informants pretty much agreed with me that their task was impossible. They saw it as kind of obvious that their models are reductive. They said, yeah, there's some subjectivity in our models tethered to the present moment, and they're significantly mediated by the history and culture of the time. They saw, as any science is, right? So they saw their models of far future Finlands as highly sophisticated, educated guesses, the most credible and robust forecasts they could develop using the best science and technology made available to them by the present era and by their employers. My new book, Deep Time Reckoning, takes this pragmatic epistemic sensibility seriously. Its goal is not to advocate for any naive realism, scientism, or positivism in reckoning the far future. And everyone gasps when I say this, I don't really advocate for or against nuclear energy either. I don't take a stance on that in the book. If you get a beer with me, I might take a stance on it though. So rather, I simply argue that the safety case expert's mission of embarking on distant future modeling projects in a self-reflective spirit can inform our current moment of global ecological devastation. The question for me is how epigraphic methods can be used to mine safety case expertise for strategies that experts and publics alike can adopt to become more skilled deep time reckoners. What can we learn from these safety case projects? I call these strategies in my book reckonings. Each chapter ends with 5 or 6 of them. And they each offer sort of takeaway guidance that I leave behind each step of the way as I follow the safety case experts into far future Finlands by interviewing them and observing them and learning how they see the world. Cultivating this kind of long-termist societal time literacy, I argue, can help us resist 2 of today's most dismal global crises. The first is the Anthropocene. What's that? Well, that's an unofficial name, currently unofficial, proposed for the troubled epoch in Earth's history that we're inhabiting, that's been ushered in by human transformations of our planet's climate, erosion patterns, extinctions, atmosphere, rock record, and more. This challenges entire populations to reimagine their ways of thinking and acting and dwelling to better sync up with our planet's radical long term. However, this second crisis is creating new obstacles. In my book, I call it the deflation of expertise. Today, in North America, Western Europe, and beyond, political power is increasingly gained through nationalist populist mockery of expertise, specifically its virtues of cautious speech and careful, meticulous, slow-moving analysis, right? So look at a Trump rally, you'll see what I mean. Vaccine science, stem cell research, polling data, climate change models, critical social theories, cell phone radiation studies, pandemic disease advisories, human evolution research. These are all routinely attacked in frenzied cable news free-for-alls and social media echo chambers, contoured by algorithms. Oxford English Dictionary named its post-truth its 2016 word of the year. Alternative fact and fake news are now mainstream buzzwords. So in this setting, it starts to strike a different chord when social theorists start critiquing the hegemony of realism, truth, and facthood, though important tasks those are in many contexts. Unfortunately, those similar analytical strategies are increasingly used to sow doubt about, say, a future-gazing climate change systems analysis model or a coronavirus epidemiological model. Foucauldian notions like power knowledge are vital in this moment. Yet we have to attend to how they resonate a little differently now. Political power, right, is increasingly gained not always through alliance with technocratic knowledge, but through this kind of charismatic performative mockery of it. Again, look at Trump rallies. Today, expert voices are routinely drowned out by Twitter mobs. They're dulled by corporate knowledge management red tape. They're exhausted by adjunctification, short-term hiring trends at universities. They're warped by these kind of short-term gig economy funding contracts, always observed by academic audits. And they're rushed by publish or perish productivity pressures. As enthusiasm for liberal arts education and scientific inquiry deflates, societies enter into this strange state of futurelessness, this futureless liminality, this manic fixation on the present moment that just shoots down proposals for envisioning future worlds. In the Anthropocene, looking our planet's radical long-term in the eye is now a pressing societal imperative. That's why I wrote Deep Time Reckoning in accessible prose. We live in times shaken by fractious social division and unraveling trust between experts and lay people. The last thing we need is yet another alienating academic tome that hides its best ideas behind impenetrable jargons, something that alienates the very people it's trying to help by making them feel dumb because they don't know all the language, the jargon and the perfect way of speaking about it. What's needed now are more stable bridges, I argue, between social and natural sciences, experts and non-experts, and the diverse cultures inhabiting this damaged planet that for many feels less and less like a friendly global village each and every day. So in this spirit, I'd ask, can collaborative engagement with safety case experts help us resist today's deflation of expertise? To answer this question, I had to first study Finnish culture anthropologically. I had to examine which aspects of Finnish culture laid the sort of groundwork for safety case experts to make bold journeys across time without caving into the onslaughts of public criticism they would get elsewhere. What did I find? Well, Finns from many walks of life described a warmth to their centralized hierarchical organizations like power plants, public transport systems, government ministries, and the welfare state. Some pointed to polls, casting Finland as unique in its high level of trust in its domestic civil servants, in its researchers, in its police, in its educators, pilots, and engineers. Others pointed to Finland's lack of historical experience with domestic techno-scientific disasters like Bhopal or the BP oil spill. Finnish social scientists told me of Finland's trust in technology's ability to produce welfare, of the strong position of administrative bodies in governance, and the involvement of academic intellectuals in kind of creating Finland's national ideology. Technocrats in Finland's Ministry of Employment and the Economy were among the most trusted figures in the country. In the US, bureaucrat and technocrat are four-letter words, basically. Now, that's not to say there wasn't domestic critique or anti-nuclear activism. There's lots of it. Some criticized Finland's icon of the virtually infallible engineer. Other Finns criticized their compatriots for uncritically embracing Enlightenment scientism and the dictates of domestic state authorities. Some hosted demonstrations like the Olkiluoto blockades, where activists blocked roads surrounding the Olkiluoto nuclear power plant. 2010, Greenpeace placed a monument of selfishness in a Helsinki park that listed the names of the parliament members, or eduskunta members in Finnish, who recently voted for expanding Finland's nuclear capacity. Way back to 1980, Finnish rock band Epu Normaali wrote an ironic song titled Suomi Ilmiö, the Finland Syndrome, that criticized Finns' culture of nuclear trust. That said, safety case work, it seemed largely non-politicized when I was there. People didn't show up to the public hearings. People weren't too upset about the nuclear waste program. Not in my backyard politicking that stopped the Yucca Mountain project in its tracks in 2009 wasn't strongly present in Finland, nor were the stagnations seen in France, the UK, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, and elsewhere. This enabled Finland to hold closely to the repository construction schedule it set in the early 1980s. Say what you want about Finnish punctuality. But let's not idealize Finnish expertise too much, right? Finland isn't perfect, right? A humanities colleague lamented how Finland's consensus valorizing debate culture made for boring, non-adversarial talk radio. To her, this deterred healthy societal critique. A wisecracking Finnish social scientist once told me, quote, "In Finland, you get to observe a near total societal embrace of Foucauldian discipline and governmentality." Certain aspects of the deflation of expertise were alive in Finland too. Finland's Talvivaara mine wastewater leaks and spread nickel, cadmium, zinc, uranium, and aluminum into eastern Finland's ecosystems starting around 2012, followed by a high-profile criminal case that followed it, caused many to wonder if Finland's extractive industry really works in their interest at the end of the day always. A scientist at the VTT Technical Research Center of Finland lamented how expertise is increasingly diluted by the private interests of commercial and investment capital and workplace audits of research deliverables, and government funding goes down, private funding goes up. You're applying for things all the time. A scientist in Finland's geological survey complained how Finland's experts increasingly waste time doing paperwork, reporting to non-scientist managers above them, and applying for funding rather than doing actual research. There's all this new corporate bureaucracy sprouting up. It's happening globally. But none of this compared to the maelstrom of discontent that I witnessed around expert inquiry when I returned to the US in August 2014. And on the eve of a very consequential election, I can tell you this has gotten worse. The reverse culture shock of coming back to the US helped me put Finland's expertise woes into perspective. In time, I became increasingly optimistic that Finland's safety case experts, whatever their foibles, their spirits of modesty, hard work, pragmatism, and self-reflection, and the societal respect for meticulous expert inquiry and cautious speech that sustained it can offer guidance. So, can anthropological engagement with Finland's safety case experts help us widen our intellectual time horizons during a moment of ecological destruction that some call the Anthropocene? Can taking this perspective seriously help us resist today's deflation of expertise? Let's take an ethnographic field trip into far future Finland and try to find out. So what's the safety case? Well, it details Olkiluoto repository's design, reports engineering principles and strategies, contains interwoven quantitative models and qualitative scenarios, and it forecasts the underground facility's fate over several millennia. In my book, I explore, as an example, how safety case biosphere assessment modelers simulated Western Finland's lakes, rivers, mires, forests, them all sprouting up, disappearing, changing shape and size over the coming 10 millennia. The experts considered how far future soil erosion, floods, and fires would occur. They envisioned a 3-kilometer glacial ice sheet during the next ice age, slated to occur, in their reckoning, 50 or 60,000 years from now. They envisioned future seismic events, earthquakes or rock shears, that could occur as the ice sheet retreats after the next ice age, as it sort of pushes back. They modeled how the current Olkiluoto Island site will eventually become an inland site. In their models, glacial rebound or uplift, kind of bouncing back from the last ice age's ice sheet now that it's gone, and eventually causes Finland's shoreline to widen further out into the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Bothnia, and it kind of engulfs Olkiluoto Island, where they're putting the waste under it, into the mainland. And they explored these really pessimistic or unlikely scenarios too. This included models of how 14 different kinds of radionuclides could conceivably escape from the repository's engineered barriers, travel through groundwater flows in underground rock fractures, and get released at various points on Earth's surface, and then kind of disperse in above ground ecosystems and bioaccumulating at times in plants and animals along the way. So that's in the safety case. I explore safety case biosphere assessor's conservative assumption that 6,000 future people, all eating local food, will live in Western Finland. This is an intentionally almost impossibly pessimistic scenario, just to show that even if things are this bad, the far future Finns are still safe. My informant's models suggested that some of these far future Finns, a critical group of them, will face a greater likelihood of exposure due to unlucky food selection. And I note how the safety case argues that all of these hypothetical future people are still going to be safely below Stoops' stringent regulatory dose limits, even under these unlikely circumstances. Remember, the safety case is regulatory science, in Sheila Jasanoff's words. Its goal is to persuade, to defend the repository. And these are Promethean labors, to say the least. However, during fieldwork, oddly, I learned that reckoning deep time requires a level of humility, too. Some of the safety case experts I met integrated self-critique, reflexivity, and admissions of vast uncertainty into their own models and reports. They did so using methods with names like knowledge quality assessment or sensitivity analysis. This meant admitting to and then systematically detailing various reductive assumptions found in their knowledge base, rather than trying to kind of conceal them or cover them up. The safety case didn't put forth one single overconfident model assumed to perfectly represent the far future, though it does have a performance assessment that is its main primary case. It forecasts a multiplicitous series of projections about potential future events, right? And each are kind of weighted with different likelihoods of occurring. They have a whole vocabulary built up around this. Some talked about it in terms of base or most likely scenarios, variant or reasonably likely scenarios, or disturbance, quite unlikely scenarios. Other informants working on other reports had a reference case, right? The most likely scenario. David mentioned it. Sensitivity cases, scenarios that include some negative future variant events, and what if cases. And these are the really unlikely kind of worst case scenarios that they model to kind of bound possibilities. So as my informant saw it, venturing these multiple parallel visions of tomorrow can tell us something, but surely not everything about far future Finlands. But it's better than not embarking in the first place. These multi-timescale, multi-perspective, multidisciplinary sensibilities ground many of my end of the chapter reckonings that I extract from their work. One reckoning is about envisioning what my informants called multiple lines of evolution. When we reckon with deep time, we have to venture several multi-pronged visions of potential future worlds, always in the plural. Future Finlands, plural. A second reckoning is about self-critique that doesn't paralyze action. Don't fall into this nihilistic abyss of hopelessness. Don't never be afraid to embark in the first place in thinking about the future, right? Cautiously applying scientific rationality to far futures can add some structure to your thoughts, right? It can help overcome the feeling of meaninglessness, awe, mystery, or terror that can well up when we gaze into deep time's abyss. But let's never trick ourselves into thinking we're achieving a certainty, and our work is never complete. Safety case experts developed a stepwise approach of progressively developing new, improved versions of the safety case that ideally grow more robust over the years, hopefully. They call these successive versions iterations. Each iteration is kind of a work in progress, right? New iterations are released every 10 or 15 years until the Ocular repository is planned to be decommissioned around the year 2120. That's a long project. So the next safety case iteration is going to be the operating license application, and that's scheduled for submission late next year. The first major safety case report or first formative safety case report was 1985. Or it wasn't called a safety case, but it was a forerunner to the safety case. A third reckoning is about what my informants called multiple lines of reasoning. It means convening several different kinds of experts with different disciplinary backgrounds to pursue something that is what philosopher Adrian Curie calls methodologically omnivorous. If you don't trust the quantitative models of ecosystems or hydrogeology, safety case experts say, hey, turn to this engineer's defense of the barrier system, right? If you don't trust those, look at the mechanical strength test done on the copper canisters. If you don't trust those, turn to the qualitative scenarios that kind of detail far future Finlands in prose. And this is an approach of strategic redundancy. It resonates a little with what we call in the US among safety people defense in depth. It integrates the logics of many different fields to ensure that one potentially inaccurate assumption doesn't invalidate the wider range of projections that are being ventured, right? So to me, this isn't perfect, right? This isn't a perfect way of reckoning deep time, but this multi-perspectival form of interdisciplinarity is really a refreshing counterpoint to the kind of myopic reductionist scientism that generated many of the intractable problems of the Anthropocene that we're now all facing. So in this spirit, let's pick one line of reasoning in the safety case and delve a little deeper into it, right? Analogical reasoning. My informant studied a glacial ice sheet near Kongerlussuaq, Greenland as an analog, a present-day stand-in feature used for the sake of comparison. They used it to make inferences about the fate of a glacial ice sheet during and after the next ice age. They pointed to a Mesozoic copper deposit preserved for 170 million years without succumbing to major corrosion, and that was encased in mudstone in Devon, England. This became an analog for the repository's copper nuclear waste canisters I mentioned. Then they studied Lake Lapajärvi. It's a crater lake that resulted from a meteor crashing into Finland roughly 73 million years ago. They approached it as an analog for how Finland's landscape could change over the next several ice ages. Yet my informants didn't apply analogical reasoning just to geophysical features. This is where the anthropologists start to get interested. They also did archaeological analog studies. They pointed to a 2,100-year-old human cadaver in China, and surrounded by clay and discovered alongside wood, vegetables, silk, and meat. I was happy to see that mentioned in David's book, Footprints. They reported the body to be well preserved. Its abdominal organs were intact. Its skin was completely there. Its joints were still movable. It was never even mummified. The vegetables and meat surrounding it were only partially decomposed, and the clay had made an airtight seal around them. Now, safety case experts look at this and they say, okay, here's an analog for how the bentonite clay that we're going to, surround the repository canisters with could preserve the canisters, copper canisters, and their cast iron inserts over thousands of years. They also study a bronze cannon from the shipwrecked Swedish warship Kronen from the 17th century. It was submerged for almost 3 centuries in Baltic seawater and seabed, kind of half in the water, half in the seabed, clay-like environment. And the cannon becomes an analog for Finland's and Sweden's copper nuclear waste canisters, whether or not they'll corrode. They also study 2,000-year-old Roman nails unearthed in Scotland as analogs for determining whether the canister's cast iron inserts inside them, where you put the spent fuel bundles, will corrode in the future. So what's this have to do with me? Well, during my fieldwork, I found myself kind of following these analogies widely across time. In my book, I chronicle this analogical journey. I take pit stops in the Roman Empire, in a future Finland that looks like Mars, in Gabon during our planet's earliest history, in other planets, ancient China, regions of South Africa in the year 2030, in West Virginia during World War II and beyond. After that, I compare these nuclear waste analog studies to various different types of, climate analog studies and space analog studies, which are analogous kinds of studies, if you will, that NASA has conducted here in the US. And I read about their limitations, of course, too. There's certainly limits to what, say, a bronze cannon submerged in the sea for centuries can really tell us about a copper nuclear waste canister buried in granite bedrock for millennia. Huge limits. Clear limits to what native copper found in mudrock in Devon can tell us about manufactured copper canisters found in clay in Olkiluoto. Of course there's limits. Some informants I met said the difference between the repository components and their analogs are simply too vast to make reasonable analogies between them. One big critic noted how safety case experts tend to cherry pick these analog examples to support their arguments. They don't scour the globe looking for counterexample analogs that could call the repository concept into question. That said, we have to keep that in view, but we also have to adopt the kind of self-reflective, multi-perspective, multidisciplinary sensibility that my informants laid out for me during fieldwork. Analogs still have something to teach us, even if they never offer us anything like certainty. They have to be seen in multiple lines of reasoning. So what do they offer? They offer an empirical concreteness and a materiality, right? A palpable materiality that's more tangible than empty speculation, much better than guesswork. They are good to think with about the far future. So I'm pretty inspired by nuclear waste analogs while keeping their limitations in view. And I use them to derive even more reckonings, right? The reckonings ask, can integrating far-sighted flights of analogy into our day-to-day ponderings help us kind of sharpen our deep time reckoning skills? Can doing routine intellectual exercises, comparing different objects across time and space, help us reflect on possible similarities and differences between distant past, distant future, and present day worlds? To what extent can analogs help us envision, say, what our home regions might look like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of years from now? To ask these questions is to approach analog studies as what historian Gabriel Hecht calls interscalar vehicles. These are objects that can kind of draw us to move through deep time and through human time, through geological space, and navigate political space too. Hecht's concept helped me revisit safety case analogs as means for connecting stories and timescales that are usually kept apart. And when I was thinking about this, I didn't have to travel very far from my workplace at George Washington University to begin following these analogs or different analogs around town analogically across time. In 1922, excavators were clearing ground for building Washington, D.C.'s Mayflower Hotel. When they did, they found fossilized bald cypress trees 20 feet below Washington, D.C.'s surface. Trees lived to be about 1,700 years old. They'd grown roughly 100,000 years ago. Back then, America's capital city was a literal swamp. Today, 4 bald cypress trees, planted in the mid-1800s, grow in Lafayette Square, right near GW's Elliott School and the White House. And GW's Elliott School is the organization that's kindly hosting this event. When I walk by them after work, the trees became interscalar vehicles to me. They became empirical analogical resources I could kind of draw upon to help me think more widely across time. They provided me with kind of tree imageries I could use to envision and reimagine the nation's capital analogically as a prehistoric swamp. In my book, my reckonings challenge readers to do the same. I take my cues from safety case experts' analog studies, and I suggest we all ask, if climate scientists forecast my current place of residence to someday look like a desert, can I draw from mental imageries I already have of Arizona or the Sahara to help me reimagine my area with different life forms more devoid of life? My current city is forecasted to look something like far future Finland in the Ice Age. Could I draw upon what I learned from the analogs at Greenland's Kongerlussuaq ice sheet to help picture it? To what extent? How could I reinforce this with more information? Well, there's online scientific tools like CGIAR's climate analogs application that helps me compare my home region's future climate to analogous regions' current climates. So when we add new scientific information and analogs, right, to our inventories, we not only make better at making new analogies across time, we get better at breaking bad analogies across time too. Pondering this, I suggest safety case analog studies can inspire something like a calisthenics for the mind and long-termism, right? Routine intellectual workouts or intellectual exercises based on analogies. They ask, at what point do the similarities between two objects we're analogizing become so pronounced that they break the analogical tie between them? At what point do they no longer shed meaningful light on one another? What degree of sameness and what kind of sameness must be present to make an analogical connection across deep time? If an analogy is imperfect, I argue it can still add value. At least some useful information can be extracted from it, especially when put in multiple lines of reasoning. And it can help us refine how we envision potential futures, always in the plural as the Anthropocene takes hold. This can outfit us, as it did for the safety case experts, with an evidence-driven toolkit more tangible than navel-gazing speculation. If entire populations were to develop these Anthropocene skill sets, a much grander transformation in temporal reckoning, time reckoning, could take place. Turning to long-sighted experts, like those who made analog studies, could help us resist the deflation of expertise and the shallow time horizons it imposes. So there's a little sample. But remember, deep time reckoning is a work of anthropology. It introduces several safety case experts to the reader in person. I've given them all pseudonyms. If you read my book, you'll meet Risto, Laura, Taimi, Juha, Anders, Oppo, and Gustav. And most of the reckonings I glean, I will say, from interacting with them are positive. Some are cautionary tales. The last chapter explores how the safety case was thrown off course for months in 2005 when a prolific but abrasive key expert died unexpectedly. To protect his identity, I renamed him Seppo. During fieldwork, I traced how safety case experts kind of summon or conjure or channel memories of Seppo, whose specter was said to still haunt their safety case community. Not literally, of course. For some, the afterlives of Seppo's expertise manifested as gaps in knowledge left behind by an expert reluctant to document how he did his modeling work. For others, there's anecdotes about Seppo's stubbornness, irritability, intellectual intensity, and his more jovial demeanor on sauna nights, workplace parties, and trips abroad. Others caught themselves asking, what would Seppo do here when troubleshooting at work? This reminds us of how challenging it can be to build intellectual infrastructures that outlast any single expert life. I hope the reckonings that I gleaned from the kind of organizational fallout of Seppo's tragic death can help us work toward embracing and building more long-sighted societies. The reckonings are about embracing an ethic of predecessor preservation, I call it, or successor stewardship, right? This means carefully tending to and disseminating ideas from prolific deep time reckoners so their contributions to humanity's long-termism don't die off before their biological deaths. This can inch us towards resisting our current intellectual, political, and ecological crises. And friends and colleagues, hate to say these crises are pretty grave. Earlier this year, the Trump administration advanced a proposal to reform key National Environmental Policy Act regulations to read, quote, effects should not be considered significant if they are remote in time, geographically remote, or the product of a lengthy causal chain. These conditions make Seppo and other safety case experts' efforts to protect future worlds seem truly alien. My hope is that deep time reckoning can help us escape these shallow time horizons, that the Anthropocene, the deflation of expertise, and the current administration, and loads of other factors impose before we succumb to Earth's ecological death spiral. So that's a little sample of my book's content and its overall vibe. There's a lot more going on in there. As I said, there's a lot of ethnographic descriptions. You learn about my informants, with what they do after work, their pet hedgehog, and everything. How they express themselves, how they articulate themselves, what kind of books they read, music they like, all things like that too. So thank you so much for listening for this little snippet. I'll turn it back over to David for Q&A, and I really look forward to any and all questions, and thanks for listening.
Wow, thank you, Vincent. That was tremendous. That was such a wide-ranging and rich, well, first of all, passionate defense of expertise and what expertise entails, but also ranging across this fascinating idea of interscalar vehicles and analogs as kind of material storytelling, and that shifting boundary between the verifiable and the imaginable, and where that takes us in terms of the deep future. So much to talk about. But maybe to start with, would you mind just telling us a little bit about the project on the to design and build the repository itself? And you spent a lot of time with the people who are working that. What did they think about what they were doing? Did they feel the mystique of it or not? Did they have anything to say about what it was like to work on a project that would be ongoing long after they died? Vincent, I think you're muted.
I am muted. Not
there we go.
and Yeah, that's pretty interesting, because before I went to the field, I watched David Ferrier's documentary Eternity about the very project I'd be looking at when I was there. The documentary showed this kind of forbidding aesthetics, right? This a dark and dreary place where people are asking these philosophical questions and about the far future and how to communicate, create a semiotic system to communicate with them. But a lot of those questions I didn't encounter when I came to the field, because a lot of those questions were really about WIP repository in the US, building this having the monks screaming man art placed in the middle of the desert to mark the repository, this huge field of thorns, these art projects to warn future generations, all different languages. Nuclear semiotics, in that sense, wasn't strongly present there. My informants idea was to make everyone forget about Onkolo, most of them, and they said, that's a fun thing we talk about at the coffee machine now and then, but overall the plan is to kind of forget about it, put it in this uninteresting geological area with no minerals in Western Finland, cap it, and then try to forget about it rather than trying to mark it, right? So a lot of this kind of sci-fi and haunting aesthetics around nuclear waste deep time weren't present. I was in normal nice offices. They have saunas in them. They have fluorescent lights. They have nice little, reprints of art on the walls. And the time horizons most of them were fixated on, right? Or kind of what I was fixated on back at Cornell when I started, right? Schedules, deadlines, project funding timelines, what time's the meeting and how do I, organize this around my dentist appointment this afternoon. So there's a lot of deep time kind of became shallow or became normal or a mundane artifact of everyday institutional life. Deep time was something that was not some sublime reverie, right? It was kind of papered into my informants' everyday office lives. That said, as every anthropologist knows, when you go out to the field, you get this huge polyvocal, as you'd say, range of perspectives, right? That don't really congeal into anything. And you leave more confused than you started. So yeah, some of them were really interested in that. Others were just it was a job, it pays well. And then other of them were oh, my mom said I should work for this, so I decided, mom is best, I believe is one of them told me. And others were fiercely passionate about reckoning far future and had all this stuff to say. So it takes a village to make far futures appear. Is kind of...
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, it's fascinating to think that this kind of thing could become mundane, because what's so appealing, I think, to the imagination, first of all, is the way it stretches how we think. And create space for all kinds of new challenging ideas to come in. What do you think about the decision not to mark it? Do you think that's a good idea, as opposed to the WIP, as you mentioned, which has a very kind of baroque system for communicating the danger of this site, supposedly for 10,000 years? Would you prefer to leave it unmarked?
Yeah. I think it's a good idea. There's a part of us. I don't know. I mean, if I saw a huge, amazing archaeological, I'm an anthropologist, right? If you see this huge, amazing thing in the desert, a part of you says, I'll risk my life to see what's down there.
Yeah. It becomes a compulsion.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, in my book, I play around with that a little bit. I start each chapter with a little vignette that takes place in the far future. The one for that chapter is about far future community around Olkiluoto. It's long forgotten, but it still persists in myths, right? There's still this. I just made this up, so I mean it's obvious. It's in a special format, so the reader knows I made this up. But it's a speculative thought experiment, right? So it's far future in this area around Olkiluoto, and there's this myth about this underground dragon named Lohikarme, which is the Finnish word for dragon, and it actually is the word for lohi, salmon, and karme, snake, salmon snake, that lives underground, and it shoots radiation at whoever happens to dig there. So memories kind of exist locally in the form of myths and legends. That's the most powerful way, I think. Thomas Sebiok, a semiotician, had a similar idea for WIP. that the Catholic Church is one of the longest beacons of long-term institutional memory. And then oral traditions, right? Like look at the Aboriginal societies in Australia and all those other sorts of cases. Stories tend to persist for a long time. Granted, they're contorted and changed through a slight intergenerational telephone, but sometimes really important information can be conveyed. He said produce an atomic priesthood where people meet up, kind of like Burning Man in the desert, and repeat, do not dig here, this is a forbidding place. And I think that method's actually, there's something to that, but I think the Finns are really onto something with forgetting about it. That seems the most kind of pragmatic and realistic, and carries the least amount of assumptions about future societies with it.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that there's that's, it's a very astute way to look at it. I mean, it's about trust, I suppose, ultimately. Lots of questions are coming up in the chat, so I feel that I should stop monopolizing your attention. And the first question really brings us right back to Earth and the present day. And effectively, it asks: does the project create divisions within Finnish society? Are people? I mean, I think you gestured towards this in the presentation, but if you could say a bit more about how do Finns more generally feel about this? Are they strongly for or against the project?
Right. So I'm an anthropologist. I conducted fieldwork from 2012 January until August 2014. So a lot of my immersion is from that time period. So my vivid sense of what's going on is from them. The rest I just hear from conversations with colleagues and reading reports and things like that from over here in the U.S. But at that time, did it create divisions? I would say the repository project did not. Now, divisive, a little more divisive, was the question of whether they should build a new nuclear power plant, the Hanhikivi V1. Should we really be buying a reactor from Rosatom in Russia? This, used to be the USSR ministry, and it turned into, hundreds of companies and subsidiaries. Should we really be building this and putting it there? And there was this Case Puhajoki art activist project. A lot of the people were expats, but also Finns kind of resisting it. That was a little contentious. Now there's this other project, Olkiluoto 3, building a new nuclear reactor. That actually was supposed to go online in 2009. It's still not online yet. I actually got an entire PhD in anthropology, which takes 7.5 years, and did a full postdoc and assistant research professor, whatever I am now, in the amount of time before it was supposed to go on and when it actually is going to go on, which is, who knows, sometime in the next year or two, or we'll see. I think COVID might have delayed it a little too. So that was contentious. The cost overruns were contentious. And then the Fennovoima, the new company building the Hanhikivi reactor, there was a contentious debate about, well, Posiva and Posiva, the nuclear waste company building the repository, is owned by Fortum and TDO, Teollisuudenvoima. They didn't want to let Fennovoima into the repository. They said, build your own repository, because why would we let our competitor into our repository? Then there's this debate, and now I think they're selling their services to them. It's a whole thing that created some divisions. But most people just saw the repository as kind of a curiosity, something to read up on. In the US, my new project's on transuranic drum breach accidents in the US. That's nuclear weapons waste. You're dealing in like these communities in New Mexico and Nevada, Idaho, that have had nuclear energy here. It's a little more, not so much in Idaho, but it's a lot more contentious. And when you have a hearing, people actually show up and are yelling at each other sometimes, or like really upset or get really passionate and emotional. I didn't see much of that in Finland. So Onkalo was kind of a curiosity. And this links back to the kind of cult of the Finnish engineer. Cult is a strong word, but the deep reverence for practical, pragmatic geotechnical engineering, this trust in the bedrock, this billion-year-old bedrock underneath it, right? And then and trust in technocrats in the Ministry of Employment and Economy in the U.S. In my new project, it's all under the Department of Energy, which is not a trusted organization widely across the U.S. Overall, history of nuclear weapons production. It used to be the Atomic Energy Commission. But in Finland, the whole complex, the nuclear energy complex, and they don't have nuclear weapons there, is under the Ministry of Employment and Economy, and that's a very trusted organization when I was there. So I would say it was more of a curiosity, and views were pretty mild on that.
Right.
But one final thing I'll say is about eco-modernism. It came out of the Breakthrough Institute and all the other places. It's kind of like a techno-optimist. Let's not rule out nuclear energy. Let's not rule out GMOs, brand of environmentalism. Some people think it's propped up by the industry. I think there's a little more to it than that. I've written about it elsewhere, but that's quite popular in Finland. And it really took off there. So it says something. And Finland's only 5.5 million people. So, I mean, it's a lot smaller than the US. We're 400 million, all sorts of people fighting each other. So.
A lot less heat, maybe. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating the scales that this takes you to. You said that I guess people were living their lives, and it's interesting to think about Onkalo, but doesn't dominate. And there's a question here that thinks along those lines as well. That we've both been talking about the importance of deep time thinking, taking a long horizon approach to the future, but the present moment, it says here, is also so contracted by the need to focus on surviving the pandemic, political uncertainty, economic precarity. So how does the contraction of time into this intensified present challenge the need to think deep time? Are there valuable strategies to distill from this present moment that can work for far futures? I guess it's about how do we negotiate between the urgent and deep time thinking?
So pre-Trump, pre-COVID, when I did this fieldwork, the thing I kept kind of thinking was, cost billions to build these nuclear waste repositories, especially the ones in other countries, which are just like they try to build them for years, and for either technical or political reasons, they don't stick around. Cost billions. If you just reinvest that money in cancer wards or fixing the roads or everyday safety systems, you can save tens of thousands of people right now, probably more, hundreds of thousands in the present moment. From a utilitarian perspective, it seems strange to allocate all that money to save these notional people 10,000, 20,000 years from now, right? And how many are really going to get hurt, right? Is it just going to be the person who digs down there and then opens up the canister? So if you want to be like a cold utilitarian, there's something about this. But then there's also, go back to Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, about cleaning up your own waste. There's something about people want to push waste outside of structure and clean it up after themselves. So interesting, it kind of flew in the face of short-termism. That's my first part of the answer. The second part is economic precarity is all about this. As I meant, the deflation of expertise, I can personally say, I want to sit around reckoning deep time all day, but I spend 20% of my time applying for grants, reporting on what I did, filling out paperwork, blah, 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 trying to secure the next year of funding. I mean, all my field informants a lot of them were under the same kind of, not the ones who had secure jobs at Posiva and things like that, but a lot of the subcontractors at various places and workers and things like that. Yeah, I mean, those are the times we're living in. I mean, people are rushed, they're stressed, but Finland is a little better at that. I have a whole chapter on the welfare state, and people take time to go to the sauna, and there's a little more time for your family, and there's a little less fear because you don't lose your job, you don't lose your health insurance, and things like that. That made it a little better for experts, I'd say. I know people who adjunct in Finland, for example, and they still have health insurance, for instance.
Wow.
In the US, you don't get benefits for things like that. As for COVID, yeah, again, I mean, it's fascinating. I would say that those questions intermingle. At the WIP repository in the US right now, there's currently a small COVID outbreak. Underground repositories are mines, right? So the airflow is kind of limited. When they had an accident there, the air moves through the entire thing, so the radionuclides kind of got everywhere.
Wow.
You don't want to think of an outbreak in a mine. So,
No.
That's an interesting place where the deep time and real short term of bodily, similar to Seppo's death that I talked about at the end, where bodily temporalities interface with deep time in a strange way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if I could, I'd just say a little bit as well in response to that question, and follow up what you've said about that convergence of priorities and the convergence of the edge and the very kind of deep time, because it comes back to that question of Roman Krasnareks. How do we become better ancestors? What kind of world do we want to leave behind? And I think the example of the safety case designers and engineers is that the world that we want to leave behind is the world we have to build now. If we want the kind of the thing that the world that we want future generations to inherit, really, it should, we should try and make the one that we live in look as much like that as we can. These priorities are not so far apart. I think it's not a case we either choose to address the problems of right now or the problems of many millennia hence, because if we don't address these problems right now, they will continue to be the problems of many millennia hence. Future generations will have to deal with the same issues. Speaking of which, another question is: did you ever encounter recognition or awareness of intergenerational justice amongst your fieldwork?
Yes. There's a robust literature on intergenerational justice. Christian Schrader-Frechette writes about that a lot. Encourage everyone to check that out. Intergenerational justice. Yes. I mean, one of the kind of lines of argumentation follows the track of well, we created this mess. This is what my field informants would say. Like, reckoning a lot of them. Again, it's a village, polycultural village. So this is what most of my field informants would say, right? For many, the nuclear waste exists, right? Like that, it's immutable. Someone called it an immutable immobile, as a play on words with Bruno Latour's immutable mobiles. So it's an immutable immobile. It exists. We pragmatically have to get rid of it, right? Reckoning deep time is impossible. The future is unknowable with full and complete certainty. However, we have to do something, and geology, engineering, and systems analysis, and climate science can be put together to give us something credible, a credible answer about what the future will be like, right? Something more credible than just making stuff up and pulling things out of your head. And it's our ethical obligation, since these generations built this stuff and created this waste, we have to be the ones to get rid of it. So one thing, to go to the, I'm giving this talk at an international affairs, kind of IR school type of context. One of the things other countries should pay attention to is Finland's state nuclear waste management fund. Since the start in the early 80s, Finland's put aside, as a condition for operating a nuclear reactor in Finland, you have to put aside a certain amount of money and funding for nuclear waste cleanup, and you have to prove that you're actually making good on this promise. And that's part of why it's stuck to the schedule from the start in the early 80s, basically, with give or take a year or two, 3. So that kind of integrates an intergenerational ethic into building a nuclear power plant. You can't build it, right, until you prove that you have a geological repository or some sort of solution. And the solutions changed over time. Sometimes earlier, some of the Loviisa waste went to Russia. But geological disposal of only finished waste in Finland is what they said. We're not taking care of other people's waste. We're taking care of our waste. And then when you build a plant, you have to build a repository. I think that's a lesson for other countries of integrating that into the system.
Yeah, and integrating a kind of long-term thinking.
One more interesting thing is a lot of the activist strategies, you can see too much of this in Finland, is to kind of oppose nuclear waste because having a repository is kind of the rhetorical excuse for continuing to build. That's the other way to see it, right? If you can oppose the repository, you can say, well, they don't have anything to do with waste. But Finland's interesting because they now have a justification for building. We know how to build repositories. We have a repository, so we can build plants. So
right,
two ways to look at it.
right, yeah. So it becomes a cycle. This is a great question, a really good question to end on, in fact, Vincent. So I'm gonna I'll give you this one to hopefully provide us with something to sort of take away.
Sure.
You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to chew over, but perhaps something that might feed into individual choices and actions. How does developing a deep time sensibility affect the way an individual might view their everyday life choices?
Well, there's two routes you can go. Well, no, okay, there's way more than two routes. There are two routes, but there's also loads more. One route is kind of everything is meaningless, right? Like, so there's millions of years. We're this little blip, the human story and human stories always. It's nothing. This is meaningless. All we are passionate about, my passionate little speech, it's all meaningless. So that's one way to do it, nihilism. I kind of advocate against that in my book. I think one thing I argue for in there, and you kind of got at it with these intellectual exercises with analogs, is there's something about these highly funded, tightly organized expert projects like the safety case. Don't take them too seriously. This isn't a religion, but you can extract little ways of integrating long-term thinking into your everyday intuitions, your everyday practices, your everyday actions, right? By doing these little mental exercises or intellectual exercises. So I'm thinking in my book, just talk about when I go hiking I lived outside Washington. I'm in Vancouver now, but I lived outside Washington, D.C. and Arlington, Virginia. I'd always go to West Virginia or western part of Virginia to hike in Appalachians. Everyone knows that those used to be the size of the Himalayas or the Rockies back in the day. So the challenge becomes when I'm hiking through the hills, how do I kind of reimagine this area as a much larger mountain range, drawing analogically from images of mountain ranges I have in my head. Same thing with the prehistoric swamp, imagining DC is a different term. It kind of denaturalizes or defamiliarizes the world around you. I think someone should make an app out of this where augmented reality and you pick the year and then you get to see. But it's a way of kind of distancing yourself from the present, your time-bound moment to which we're all confined, right? And then escaping it a little bit. And it makes you appreciate things a little more, I think. I have a couple of things like that. I say anyone can do that anywhere. If you're driving in the Maryland highway, you can see the side of the hills carved in. You see the strata. You can try to imagine what each layer of strata must have looked like, right, in the rock. And you can do research and collect scientific knowledge to try to understand what those different stratas look like. More scientific information is available outside of paywalls than ever before with the internet. Even though there's still a problem with the paywall. And say you live in, a place that's prone to, Bangladesh or something, and there's a huge climate change danger. You can imagine what your country will look like and what the seascape will look like as it rises, and then what will happen if sea level rise continues at the rate it's going. So integrating these little day-to-day mental exercises or thought experiments or ways of thinking into your everyday mindset, I think is a way to just get an appreciation for the world and also live more robustly, but also put your own work in perspective. Like when I'm working, am I working towards something that will help sustainably keep us going for millennia? Because everything in my surroundings is just kind of like a momentary mirage in the grand scheme of things, and it forces you to not get too caught up in the present moment.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, I think it's about having that that kind of imaginative agility, and
Right.
to see the impermanence that behind what looks so fixed. To look at a coastline and think this may radically change in the next 100 years. You've given us so much to think about, Vincent. Thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk, introduction to your book. and for giving such rich and provocative, thought-provoking answers to the questions. Can I just say to everyone who's been in attendance, thank you so much for joining us here. I hope you've gone away from this with as many new ideas buzzing around your head as I have. And as a final thing, can I just say, please go away, if you haven't done already, buy a copy of Deep Time Reckoning. It is a fantastic book. You've just had a taste of it today. There it is. It's also a beautiful object, apart from anything else. But the questions it raises, the journey it takes you on is just astonishing. Please do buy a copy.
Yeah,
Vincent?
if this book wins an award, it's just as likely to be because of the beautiful cover.
It's a beautiful
Nothing to do with me. That's totally MIT Press.
Hi everyone. I've
Thank you very much.
posted the link to the book in the chat if anyone would like to purchase a copy. Thank you so much for attending, and we're sorry that we weren't able to get to all of the questions within 1.5 hours. But thank you so much for attending.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for listening, and thank you.
And the recording will be published on the YouTube channel of the Elliott School of International Affairs, so it will be available for public viewing later. All right, I'll end the event now. Thank you so much, everyone.